Hey everyone, it's Ed. I'm sharing another episode of my occasional podcast called Climate Book Reviews. I co-host it with my old friend Dr. Roger Thompson, who has just left Stony Brook University in New York for warmer climes as a new director of writing programs and professor at Arizona State University. Our goal with the pod is to curate some climate and energy-related books worth knowing about. In this episode, we dive into the wildly imaginative and disturbingly plausible world of Ashley Shelby's acclaimed story collection, Honeymoons in Temporary Locations. Recently named one of Fresh Energy's favorite climate books of 2025 and shortlisted for the Janet Heidinger Kafka Prize, Shelby's collection has been praised by Scientific American, Forward, and the Post and Courier for its biting wit, emotional punch, and genre-bending storytelling. We had a lively, funny, and far-ranging conversation with Ashley herself while unpacking her satirical takes on resistance, inequality and privilege in crisis, and what it means to grieve and medicate away the losses brought on by climate change. If you like your climate fiction smart, satirical, and maybe a little too close to home, this one's for you. For more info, check out climatebookreviews.com. Now over to Roger, and happy listening.
Ashley, really appreciate you joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you.
I don't even know exactly where to begin on this because the book is so diverse. It has so many kind of modes of expression, I guess is the way I would say it, forms, genres. It clips along at a remarkable pace. You start a collection with, I gather, a Hugo-nominated novelette based off of Benito Cereno, which I should disclose. I'm a bit of a scholar on Benito Cereno, so I didn't know that was what that was doing, and I was reading. I was like, she must know Benito Cereno, and then suddenly go along and like, oh yeah, she absolutely does, and it's really a great, creative, challenging in the sense of it confronts you, right? Not in terms of the read. It's a great read, but it just at least challenged me emotionally. So I guess what I want to start with here is just a little bit of talking about how you've come to the intersection of your climate awareness, your interest in climate change, and the craft of short fiction. I mean, this is a tough thing to wed, so I'm curious about how you got there.
Well, gosh, I took the long road. I actually started as an environmental journalist, and my first book 21 years ago was Red River Rising, The Anatomy of a Flood and the Survival of an American City was the subtitle, and it was about Grand Forks, North Dakota, and what was at the time the most expensive natural disaster in American history, which was the flooding of the Red River, which is just very interesting because the entire community blamed that flood on the National Weather Service for not predicting the flood crest correctly. They were unfairly judged for that. I was able to get interviews with the hydrologists, and there was a quirk in a rating curve. It's a long story. I learned a lot reporting that book because I was very young. I was 22, 23. I knew nothing about life. And here I was interviewing people who had lost everything. They'd lost their homes. They'd lost, their photo books, before, the ubiquity of iPhones. But also they were told that they needed to clear the floodplain in the rebuilding effort. So they had a neighborhood that was built up right along the dike. And in what was astonishingly good decision, they decided to clear that floodplain. But the human process of that was heartbreaking. So I learned a great deal about how complicated the intersection between nature and extreme nature events and civilization and humanity can be. And that is not very straightforward. The problem with the journalism, though, is that I'm an introvert. And so that took so much out of me, interviewing people, even people when they didn't want to be interviewed. I did one more work of journalism, which was a report for The Nation on ExxonMobil's attempt to get out of paying the punitive damage portion of their settlement with the fishers of Prince William Sound. You may be familiar with it. It just dragged on for 25 years. People's lives were absolutely ruined, but they also ruined the lives of scientists. I interviewed a federal scientist who had just had his reputation completely tarnished by ExxonMobil's PR folks, and just for saying there was still oil in the Sound. And I remember I got on a float plane with him, and we went out to just sort of like a random spit of land in the Sound. It was not inhabited. It was very small. And we hop out, and he's kneeling on the sand with a child's, sand shovel, essentially like a spade. And he digs a spadeful of sand out. And he's come over and look. And I look, and he digs out one more spadeful of sand, and crude oil bubbled up. And this was in 2004. So obviously, there was still oil in the sound, but also just thinking about how long things like that stay in the ecosystem. Again, another learning experience for me. So I'm very grateful that I had the opportunity to do journalistic work because it taught me the importance of listening, obviously listening to people, hearing multiple perspectives, but also the importance of fact. And that's always been very important to me. My dad's a journalist. And one of the things that's been important to me in my fiction is that everything I write, even if it's speculative, be plausible. Or if I'm writing realistic fiction, like my first book, South Pole Station, that the science is right. I have a lot of scientists in my work, that the science is right. So it was a great preparation. But as an introvert, it was just not sustainable. So I started writing fiction. And my first novel was the aforementioned South Pole Station, set in Antarctica in the early 2000s with there's multiple plot lines because, there's very interesting people who go down there, including my sister, who is one of the only women who ever wintered over at South Pole. Wouldn't tell me much because it's a closed society. You go down there for reasons you don't want broadcast. But she would always kind of fact check. And she's like, yeah, that could happen. Or, yeah, that did happen. I mean, no, I'm not saying that did happen, but it definitely would happen in certain circumstances. So, that was really an interesting experience, especially because I have a climate denier in the book. At the time I was writing this, it was during the Obama administration. So I thought I was sort of writing a bit of historical fiction here. The climate denialism of the early, 2000s, the Merchants of Doubt. We were on the right path. I was hopelessly naive. And by the time it was published in 2017, that's how long it takes books to get published, people were telling me, oh, wow, what a critical commentary on, the climate change situation and the political situation. You're so prescient. And I'm sitting here thinking I'm not prescient. I was just a hopeful fool, And it was around that time that I was trying to write my second book. And I thought, I'm going to try and write another realistic, traditional novel. Climate change is probably going to be in my work for the rest of my career because that is the world we live in now. To me, the term climate fiction is pretty misleading because in my world, it's realistic fiction. Maybe not the wilder, more speculative stuff, but I couldn't write speculative scenarios fast enough during the writing of this particular book, Honeymoons in Temporary Locations, before it would become something on the news. Part of that is because of my journalistic background. I listen to the scientists. I love scientists. I love science. I wish I had been one. I was not built that way. I would do anything to have been built that way, but I trust and listen to scientists. And everything that the climate scientists were saying, and even if you had to read between the lines sometimes, is starting to unfold. And I think sometimes at a pace that they're surprised by, unless, and I always wonder about this, unless they're keeping the more dire possibilities from us, because I have been in conversation with certain climate scientists who feel is vitally important to always present the possibility that not that anything can be fixed, but that could be mitigated so that people don't become paralyzed. And of course, and I was listening to the Climate Energy podcast the other day with Catherine Hayhoe, who was talking about that very thing, that when you tell people there are no solutions, they're just going to shut down, but they need to be told what they can do, not what is happening. I was grappling with that. And I was finding it very difficult to write a traditional novel. It just seemed almost like fiddling while Rome burns. I'm like, I could write another realistic novel of like a marriage falling apart in the context of climate change and a woman finding herself or a man finding himself. And every time I tried it, it just seemed so unimportant to me. Yet, every time I tried to write speculative about climate change, I thought, wait, it doesn't feel speculative. It feels like it's happening right now, or it could happen. During the process of writing this, I wrote an essay for LitHub, and I proposed the term first impact fiction, which in hindsight, I just don't want it labeled that way because that's how we segregate these types of books from literature. It's like, go over to the climate fiction section, as if that's separate from our daily existence. But what I was realizing was that I was losing a language to talk about what I was feeling. And what I was feeling was grief and hopelessness, because it seemed like something could be done, but nothing was being done. But the people who could do something weren't going to do it, which I think is accurate in some ways. To me, the scientists are the heroes, but at the end of the day, they don't have the deep pockets. They aren't the Elon Musks. I wish there was a climate scientist who was Elon Musk, had like, maybe he wins the lottery and, some moonshot climate solution comes out of that. So language started to fail me. All of the tools I'd learned as a writer failed me, narrative structure, dialogue, theme, coherence even. And I just said to myself, I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to write something. I'm not going to assume anyone's ever going to read it, but I'm going to be telling myself the story and try to make sense of how I'm feeling. And the first piece I wrote, which is actually not in this collection, was a fake LinkedIn job listing for environmental migrant management and in the soil-free solutions division of a company, which again, by the way, in 2016, when I wrote that, whoa, that'll never happen. Now I feel like it could be a job listing, but it helped me realize something, that I didn't have to write in that traditional format to sort of try and make sense of how I was feeling. And that was incredibly helpful for me because, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with the philosopher Timothy Morton, but he talks of hyperobjects, which are concepts that are too big for the human mind to fully comprehend. And because we cannot do that, they're intensely scary and terrifying. And he categorizes climate change as one of those, because scientists can obviously comprehend, the facts and the data and the hows and the whys and the models. But then there's also people like me, they're trying to figure out what's going to happen to the world, what's going to happen to the animals, what's going to happen, what world are my children going to be part of? And that's all part of the same thing. And not one person can conceptualize all of it. So I just started, writing. And the Muri story, is not something I ever would have written. I would have thought it was dumb. The ask was too big. I think the ask is pretty big, if when you read it, you'll know why. But to my surprise, people were very much willing to suspend disbelief and get into that story. And I've told my dad has asked me in the past, he's like, what's your favorite story? And I said, I don't like any of my work. I'm like every writer, like everything could have been better. Or I didn't quite say it the way I wanted to say it. For me, though, it's not that Muri is so well written, is that Muri says probably most clearly how I feel, which is grief, but also a kinship with all the other creatures on this planet. And it's like my apology to them in some way for participating in a system that is going to cause suffering. But, again, even that, we talk about whose fault is it, I tell folks all the time, they come to my book talks, I'm like, it's not your fault.
When you talk about that grief, Ashley, I think of solastalgia, climaphile, and then hacking off limbs as a kind of penance for that, all of which I want to get to. But I do want to just quickly timestamp this podcast, because when, you talked about Red River Rising and flood forecasting, for people listening to this later, we're recording this just days after the Kerr County floods, in which now, unfortunately, hundreds of people, including many children at a camp called Camp Mystic, lost their lives in a catastrophic flood. And flood forecasting has been become topical and controversial again. But just to pivot a bit back to Honeymoons and Temporary Locations, which I thoroughly enjoyed, I want to mildly admonish my co-host Roger, who called it a collection of short fiction, because I don't think that term really does it justice.
Enough, yeah. Yep.
Given that you really blend traditional short fiction with Muri, but I love your documentary style, kind of recovered texts.
Yes, I love that.
Menus, brochures, Craigslist ads, podcast transcript, which speaks to my heart, or our hearts. And then your clinical case studies and kind of marketing materials. So I actually haven't come across fiction that I think is that experimentational in its form in quite the same way before. But I do want to ask you, because I love your depictions of potential climate futures. It kind of reminds me what Kim Stanley Robinson did in Ministry for the Future. Your scenarios are plausible, and I can only imagine that, it went way beyond getting your very qualified sister to do fact checking. So I'd love to know a little bit more how you researched those scenarios, and how did you decide how far to push each scenario without losing plausibility? Because again, the thing for me that I really enjoy appreciate is the plausibility.
Yeah, the publisher initially tried to categorize this as science fiction, and I said, I love my science fiction friends, but they would be so mad if they opened this book as sci-fi and then it wasn't. And so you're right, it's not the type of speculative fiction that would necessarily fit into sci-fi, because it's almost too familiar. But it's also not necessarily set in this moment. It's set in a near moment, a relatively near moment. So in terms of how I came to write this, yes, I wanted things to be, plausible to a climate scientist even. And that just required paying attention, reading sources that were not mainstream media sources trying to digest complicated climate material, but specialist magazines or podcasts or online publications. And yet, some of it was so distressing that I would kind of almost read it kind of askance, almost glossing over it, because I didn't want to get to the end and say, okay, if this is not addressed, then X, Y, and Z is going to happen. Because I kind of knew it was going to be bad. And I thought I was doing that, to kind of protect myself emotionally. But what it actually allowed me to do was come up with those sort of endpoints myself in terms of fiction. Because I think if I adhered too closely to the science, then it kind of loses that emotional aspect. It becomes too detached almost. And so humans kind of make their personal worlds messy. And so there's a little bit of messiness in the book as well, because, and humor, I hope.
Yeah, kudos. No, there's a ton of humor in there.
And good humor.
Humans, we're going to be ridiculous in any context. And that's one of the things I like about our species, is that consistency. But the thing I didn't expect as I was writing this, because what I thought I was writing were, stories about a changed world, and how humans are going to kind of exist in that world. But by the time I was finished and I'm rereading it, I'm like, wow, this is really an angry diatribe against capitalism. And I hadn't known that I had felt quite so strongly about that until I got to the end, and I was working on the marketing material for Climafiel, which is interesting because I spent a lot of time as a vaccine advocate when my kids were younger. I'm always here, big pharma, this, big pharma, that, and always pushing back against that, and always talking about, the scientists who are creating these life-saving vaccines, and just it's heroic work. And, many of the vaccine pioneers that, I was lucky enough to talk to, Paul Offit, a lot of them gave this away for free, essentially, the rotavirus vaccine and whatnot. So then to write this piece that saw a pharmaceutical industry taking advantage of a speculative environmental illness to literally just make people stop caring so they would continue going to work, so they wouldn't care what was happening around them, was a surprise to me. And, I think that happens to a lot of us writers, where it's like what Joan Didion said, we don't know what we think until we write it down, as absurd as that sounds.
Mm-hmm. And it does create a bit of a conundrum for the reader, because one thinks, is there, ever an ethical justification for treating climate distress pharmacologically versus solastalgia, which I didn't really know about until I read your book, and then went and tracked down the National Institute of Health's definition of it, and see that it's been a concept that's just kind of eluded me for the last decade and a half. Solastalgia, if it isn't something that should be cured, because it could be vital to our resistance and to actually doing something about climate change, instead of just being this emotional immune response to what is ecological destruction.
Well said. Yes. I think I say this maybe in my not my afterword, but my acknowledgments, that solastalgia is proof of love. It's proof that we love this planet. We love nature. If we didn't, we wouldn't be distressed by what happens to it. There are people on this planet, I'm one of them, who is just grief-stricken when a tree is cut down. And, in fact, I'm writing a story right now, an eco-horror fable, that's kind of was spawned by the fact that I had a forested lot right next to my house, and a guy came by and just, because he's building a house there, he just clear cut it with his own machinery. And it was extremely difficult to watch. And so I think as long as we are feeling that, we don't have to be afraid of that feeling because it means that we care and we love. And like you just said, we are more likely to fight for what we love. We're going to start seeing, however, more extreme cases of that. I think I was one of them. I'm working my way back. But there is a point where it can become completely paralyzing and you can start having those thoughts of like, well, what is the point? Or did I make a mistake bringing my children into this world? And so I think there's a balance. And for me, what has been healing has been being outside, doing things with my hands like planting a seedling, pulling invasive vines off of my oak tree, just being a fellow creature who happens to have hands who can help in small ways, that it's not over, that these individual living things, whether they're animals or plants, beautiful trees or, mosses, that they're around. They're still working. They're still trying to survive and we can help. And so I think if you're able to help in a small way, it keeps you engaged and it continues to give you hope, because what is more hopeful than planting a seed and then walking back outside 2 days later and seeing a sprout? I think that's sort of how I keep myself grounded.
I mean, I've got, and I know Ed has a story for himself, but I lived on a large property, 40 some odd acres in Virginia for a while. Ed visited and rode a tractor with me one time, but the neighbor there also up above me, so it was a property on the side of a hill, they clear cut also, besides and it's the most beautiful stand. There's no understory, just stunning, beautiful to walk up through there. And, I'm a private property guy. I acknowledge that this drives some of my thinking about things. At the same time, it's so disheartening and sad. And it changed everything about the forest around it, of course. And in fact, led to serious wind damage in the coming years for our property and another, because suddenly there wasn't that buffer, right? So there's consequences there. But for me, it's that yearning for that place. And that's where I think this Solstasia has, right? There's this yearning feature of it. And I think you're right to assess, this is actually a sign that we as humans have something positive to contribute in these discussions, right? That we yearn to have this connection, even as a place around us kind of begins to kind of break apart.
To build upon Roger's story, and I still have the scars and the distress from it that I've tried to process over multiple long meditation retreats and other forms. But as a kid, and I didn't know that I'd called it eco-grief when I first became familiar with that term much longer ago, that it was eco-grief, but a woodlot at the top of the street where I lived was cut down to make room for a new subdivision. And it wasn't even, first growth, and I didn't know the difference between first growth or second growth, but it was the woods where my little friends and I played, and they cut it down. And it actually turned us into little monkey wrenchers, and at a time before we knew what monkey wrenching was. Like, we would go up there, the construction workers would come at night, they'd lay down survey stakes, they'd put down the lumber, and literally I was like, I was grade 4, grade 5, so it would have been as a 10-year-old kid, 11-year-old kid, would have night missions, after supper, and after the workers left, we'd go up and would pull up all the survey stakes. If there were propane tanks there, we'd open up all the propane tanks.
Oh my God.
If they had left lumber there, we'd make bonfires of lumber. We did everything we could as an act of resistance without really realizing that we're experiencing eco-grief, and that was our outlet for combating it, was resistance. And for me, that was you can draw a straight line between the work that I do. I don't really do much monkey wrenching anymore. I should have mentioned that when we had the Energy versus Climate show with Andreas Malm, by the way, author of How to Blow Up a Pipeline. I should have told you a story. But you can draw a straight line between what I do today and that experience.
I mean, one experience I had while reading your book, actually, is that I was about 3/4 of the way through it, and I thought to myself, I wonder in these kind of imagined futures that show up in this collection, like how far out you're imagining, like what, is this, because it felt so present to me, right? It felt so real. And there's great humor, but there is grief in here. There's no question. You can feel it, even on some of the shorter things that are kind of pithy and hilarious. Afterwards, you set the book down, and you're like, wow, that's rough to think about the actual implications of what that might mean for somebody. And then we get to the case studies, 20s, and we're dating in the 2030s. So I guess my question to both of you all, Ashley certainly is the writer of this, a speculative imagined future, but I'm curious, Ed, your response to that also on is this as near a future now? Is this, we're in the context here now where we're not going to meet any of the target temperatures that was considered best case. And in fact, we'll probably blow past them handily. And so I'm curious about how you, Ashley, is that part of the motivation here? You're feeling that it's looming closer than ever? And Ed, where do you stand? Are we in 10 years of some of these things?
Yeah, I'd be interested to hear what Ed has to say, because to me, it feels like it's next door to tomorrow. I think 2030 was just some sort of convenient, hey, it's 10, 15 years. But I would love to hear what Ed thinks about that.
Well, sure, we're certainly blowing through targets, and there's much ballyhoo around the 1.5C target, but that was an arbitrary political set target by the IPCC. It wasn't really scientific in its basis, but we're clearly plowing through that. And the answer is we really don't know. We don't know how much the world is going to warm. Well, but, we can say safely it's going to be in this band between probably 2 to 3C. And because we've done a lot of good work around trying to decarbonize parts of the global economy, and the clean energy economy is worth $2 trillion these days, it looks like we're going to avoid the most extreme scenarios of warming, which just a few years ago was well above 3 to 5 to even more. But coming back to you, Ashley, and I'm interested in, again, these plausible climate futures. You make multiple references to sulfates and to aerosol spraying and the reality of it. And coincidentally, right after this, I'm going to go over to my Energy versus Climate co-host house, David Keith, to meet with our third co-host, Sarah Hastings-Simon, who's been on medical leave, and it's the first time the three of us will be together in about a year. But of course, he's one of the world's, if not the world's, foremost scientists thinking through what's called solar radiation management or stratospheric aerosol injection. I might contest a bit if that were deployed as widely as, you say, well, as you depict in multiple points in the book, that could really lower the temperature of the world. And at the risk of parroting David Keith, as I'm wont to do, with a spend of single-digit billions per year over 10 years, you could lower the temperature of the Earth by about 0.5 degrees C. Coming back to your plausible climate futures, I'd love to know sort of how you dug into that topic, in particular, solar geoengineering.
Sure. So part of this is the function of how collections are written. So the stories that included that were my earlier stories. And I had read a book, and I'm so sorry, I have the worst memory in the world, but I will get you the name. There was a book by a man and it was about geoengineering, which I thought was cool, but it was speculative. So he would tell me what the technology was, and then he would write a little short story about how it could potentially be deployed. Now, he was fervently anti-geoengineering at the time. I think this book came out, I want to say in 2015 or 2016. So it's not a new book. And that really captured my attention because he argued that the technologies have the potential to work, obviously, as you said, but the problem is coordinating with globally. So it's like if Indonesia decides to start utilizing sulfate technology, but this country doesn't, how is it going to impact things like their agriculture or yields or, other things too numerous to mention? And so I didn't come away with a point of view of like, this is good, this is bad. It was more just, oh, this is interesting that this exists. I realize now, as you look online, it is becoming political, as it just seems inevitable, actually. At the time I was writing that, I thought, I feel like in this speculative world, it's plausible that rather than addressing the core causes, which again, at the time that this man's book came out, that was the preferred approach. It wasn't just, let's just mitigate and keep going the way we're going. Let's just assume we're going to keep going the way we're going and then just try to address it. It was more like, let's try to stop this so we don't have to mitigate. So that was sort of the context to which that was written. But I thought, this world that I am imagining, they're going to take the easiest path that is least disruptive to capital and capitalism, that allows people to continue extracting. At that time, I thought, they'll probably just, deploy this stuff and create albedo and, do it artificially. And my understanding is that there's the potential for rebound effects. I didn't get into anything like that because that was way out of my lane. But I have only been sort of following the progress of these technologies. And I'm curious to know, is this imminent? Do you think that this is something that will be part of our everyday?
I don't think it's imminent, but I think in some of the work that I've done here in Canada and talking to the Canadian government about solar geoengineering, which it is, without outing the government, sort of quietly looking at, the scenario we put to them is, whether you like it or not, in the next 10 years, Canada and other countries will very likely be pulled into a global conversation about solar geoengineering, whether they like it or not. So they may as well be prepared and at least have a position on it, whether for, against, or somewhere in between. And that's going back to your point around Indonesia, or what Kim Stanley Robinson writes about in Ministry for the Future around India. It is possible that a country sort of decides unilaterally to start deploying it because it is cheap. The dispersal methods aren't that complicated. You can pretty much use existing technology, and it might be a bulwark against a lot of people dying, or in the case of Ministry for the Future, tens of millions of people dying in a single extreme heat event. One thing, though, I want to go back to you, because it is very plausible, and I think it's very near term, is I really loved in the book your exploration of inequality and the social satire on privilege in crisis. Before, in our pre-chat, we were talking about, I think, the great book that Kirsten McDougall has written called She's a Killer, in which she coins this term wealthugees, people who flee with wealth to New Zealand away from places that are in real climate crisis. You write about things like luxury apocalypse bunkers that the uber wealthy have built over the country, biophilic experience pods for the obscenely wealthy. I'm quoting your book directly now. Environmental exposure therapy for the solastalgic 1%. The wealthy starting to protect and insulate themselves against the worst effects of climate change through some adaptation method is really happening now.
Yep.
So I'd love to know more just about your research around that. And to your question around Nero fiddling while Rome burned earlier on, this is really a case of another reference. It's like the Titanic's class-separated lifeboats. Tell us more about that, because that was a fascinating part of the collection.
Oh, wow. Well, thank you. Again, it was sort of a challenge when the speculative seems to become documentary in real time. And, by the time actually this book was published last summer, I took a couple things out because I felt like it seemed too on point, because it was happening. There was in my Craigslist ad chapter, I mean, not really chapters, but my Craigslist ad, there was a support group for recently displaced, millionaires from Newport Beach, California. And, we had these fires. Gosh, I mean, it's these disasters come one right on top of the other. So it sometimes seems like it was a long time ago. But the California fires that just absolutely ravaged many neighborhoods, obviously, all different, socioeconomic state. But the really wealthy folks, too, their homes are burning down. And it was very interesting to see the media focus on these burned out mansions instead of showing us homes in the middle-class neighborhoods. Interviews were so often with wealthy white homeowners. Celebrity homes that got damaged were always highlighted. I thought that little section in that Craigslist ad, like if someone reads it next year, it's going to seem like, what is this? It's not going to feel speculative. I think that, again, when these were written, it was in the first Trump term and then in Biden's term. What we're seeing right now is just cartoonish in terms of this wealth gap. It almost feels like it's something somebody would have written speculatively, the way things are going. And so I did not anticipate that. That seemed to have accelerated over the course of just months. Or it was always happening, but it was just more carefully hidden. I'm not sure which. I'm thinking it's probably the latter. But I absolutely feel that in addition to these, I put this in quotes, the apocalypse being monetized and sold back to us, which I feel so sure that that's what's going to happen as we face more climate disasters. The wealthy are already starting to hoard resources. They're already building towns in, I think it's either California or Nevada, that are going to have very high walls. They have access to resources we don't. I'm sure they're going to try to gain control over things like water sources. Paolo Bacigalupi, who wrote The Water Knife, which is a work of climate fiction set in the Four Corner states. It's about water wars between those 4 states. And that was published 8 years ago, maybe. Things like that also now start to seem plausible. We start to see people marshaling resources and who's going to own what. A luxury bunker underground no longer seems like a stretch, especially when we know they are already doing that. And then for what purpose? My son asked me the other day, he's like, these billionaires, they're like building bunkers and they're building spaceships to like get off the planet. And yet they're helping accelerate toward an uninhabitable planet. He's like, I get that they want even more money. He's like, but how is this even good for them? Because they can't live, they're human too. They can't live in a planet like this. Do you want to live underground, for 80 years? Is that their plan? And I said, I think that what we're looking at is a mental illness. We're looking at something's not right. It doesn't make sense how they're operating. It's as if they don't believe they're human. It's as if they don't believe they're one of us. And it's just like the movie, Don't Look Up. At the end of the day, maybe they do survive. But what are they surviving to? What happens when they get on the other side? So that is something I think about a lot. I tend to think it's inevitable unless there's kind of like a reckoning where the rest of us sort of say enough.
It's great you brought up Don't Look Up because I'm just now realizing that, and I hadn't thought about that book in relation to this, but the feeling I had after that is much like the feeling I had after reading your book. And I hadn't thought about that till you just mentioned that, but I laughed more during your book because of these things. But again, as I kind of mentioned earlier, I'd laugh on some of them, some of the Craigslist ads in particular, some of the descriptions of the absurdity of some of these studies being done, and then I'd close the book and I'd just be gnawing at me, still kind of like, yeah, but I'm a little afraid this isn't entirely not plausible, right? Like this isn't entirely speculative. There's enough grounding there. And that I think is a real masterstroke on your part, right? And regardless of what the future portends, the fact that you've left us with this sense of, no, this is viable, right? This is thing. And this is probably where I pivot as Ed knows, my training's in rhetoric, where I'm interested in persuasion and how we're trying to persuade people to think about climate, how we're trying to get people to act in certain ways, which is the goal of persuasion. And so I guess I want to pose that question to you, which I do to a lot of the writers who we visit with, is, who do you see this book able to persuade, or do you care about that? Do you want them to simply feel? But surely, given the content of what you want people to. I mean, I assume that's a fictional autobiographical Ashley who appears here, right? That is not a static observer, right? That is a person of real agency. So I'm curious about, who are you trying to reach here?
So that's a very interesting question, because I usually answer it as an artist, which is that I feel really strongly that once I put something out in the world, it's no longer in my control. And what you take from it is completely valid, and it's a conversation between us, but I don't get to dictate the terms. I don't get to persuade you. I don't get to tell you what I meant. If someone says, I see, Muri as a fable about the dangers of AI, I'm not going to look at that person and say that is completely wrong. That's not what I was trying to do. I'm going to say, that's so interesting. Can you tell me why you think that? How did you come to that? Because that was what was true for them. I'm pretty clear-eyed about this particular book. I had very little expectation of a wide readership. One, because it is sort of structurally odd. It has a lot of different things in it that for some people, they like that. There's some bite-sized stuff. They don't have to, sit down for 30 minutes and finish a chapter, except Muri, which is the novelette that opens it. But there's others who, like I mentioned in our pre-chat, might, if they don't think about climate change a lot, if it's not important to them, may find it depressing. I had a book club of older ladies tell me that they could only read one page a night. Just as a writer, no writer wants to hear that. But I knew it wasn't because of the writing. I knew it was because there's something in them that knows it's true. They won't say it, but they know this is a problem. They don't
feel like if they said that, they missed the satire.
Yes, I think, and to be honest, I'm not even sure how May finished it, but that is the one thing that I wanted to make sure was part of this, was that I don't survive this life without humor, even dark humor. I had hoped, that was the one thing I had hoped that would leaven some of it, were those moments. But who it would persuade, I don't really see, and that's a larger conversation about where art sort of functions in this conversation about climate and storytelling. I don't know that art can persuade. I think art can illuminate corners that perhaps were dark to certain people. And I think that's pretty much all it can do. It can illuminate and it can move. But in terms of persuasion, I think that's a more complicated process. I think it would take more than a book to do that, unless it's a great nonfiction book, like Elizabeth Kolbert's books or, Catherine Hayhoe's. And so that's sort of where I fall on that. But I also empathize with people who find it hard to read apocalyptic scenarios about climate change. And there's a lot of them. In fact, there's more now where there's kind of more realistic or near future fiction about climate. But until recently, it was almost all 100 years out. And it was all very apocalyptic. Kim Stanley Robinson's was probably one of the first to have some sort of hopeful aspect to it. But that's hard to read when it doesn't feel like science fiction anymore. Science fiction, there's a distance. And you're like, oh, wow, that'll never happen. So I can comfortably read this, knowing that this will never come, into my existence. But climate change apocalyptic fiction can be very hard to read now because it feels like a reminder of what, for some people, we feel is inevitable. And yet we don't know what we're going to do. So that's another reason why I was not going to write a novel, set in the future about climate change, because I wouldn't have even read it. It almost hurts too much. But this being having such short aspects to it, it's almost like you can take it like a page at a time.
Yeah. And just to pick up on a couple, the Winfield Scott case study, or they don't tell you where to put the pain. And I guess those Climafield case studies, just in terms of your temporal structure, I really liked how you would walk people essentially through the decades and where they were at in their personal journeys, and by extension, where the world was at in terms of a changing climate. Perhaps to the book club ladies, that one it did have this kind of Stephen King-esque part. And I really, as I talked about before, I love the blending of the uber rich and privilege in crisis. The self, and a spoiler alert, the sort of the story of self-amputation as a form of penance. That was difficult and yet fascinating. Now, perhaps I have a higher pain threshold when it comes to the slightly morbid. But going back to Murray, dear listener to this podcast, I hope you become a dear reader of Honeymoons and Temporary Locations. It's an exquisitely beautiful story.
It is.
With a really interesting hook and interesting references, you've got just the reference to St. Vitus dance and blood-soaked shoes. So, and the prose is beautiful. On one hand, you might be hitting upside the head with some of the concepts, but it is just readable, flowy prose, and that story in particular, and it's good it's short because you can't put it down mid-story. You just, once you start reading it, I was hooked, and you just got to read it, and kudos. And that's not the only, that's the whole book. And I'll say again, I love your experimentation with the form, with all blending all these difficult rhetorical devices. It makes for a really compelling collection, and unlike anything that I've really read before.
That's so overwhelming, and that means so much coming from both of you, as accomplished as you are and what you do in your work. That truly means so much to me. And when I tell my dad, he's going to be so happy, because he knows that, to me, having people at the highest level of rhetoric and English and obviously climate science, that's like, hey, I did it, Dad.
Ashley, you did it. You did it.
You did it. Yeah. If you need a letter, we'll send one for your dad so he can take a look at it.
Yeah. And on a family note, just before we jumped on this recording, I went to my daughter, who, it's a rainy day here, so we're supposed to go out for a bike ride. Instead, she's on the couch going through the Wordle archive. I showed her, I'm like, you really should read this. This is a great work of fiction. It's difficult with an 18-year-old daughter to influence her or anything, but I'm going to come back. And so that is also another testament. Like, I'm recommending it to my immediate family, my daughter, and I know that she won't get weirded out by it or she won't get put off by it, but she'll find it engaging and ultimately insightful around what could be around the corner, whether in the next couple years or the next decades.
Well, and you know what? Maybe one day my teenagers will read it. I have been unsuccessful in persuading them yet, even though it's dedicated to them. Wasn't enough of a bribe, apparently.
Well, I think that's actually, and I'm just going to echo real quickly how wonderful the collection is, how diverse it is, but also I just want to again emphasize what Ed said about Muri, which I find a really, really compelling. I don't know who else you were up against on that Hugo Award, but I would have put you up top for sure. And so if you don't have time to grab anything else, grab Muri, but it's going to hook you and then you'll grab the rest also. So we just really want to thank you, Ashley, for taking the time and sharing your talents with us. They're considerable and they're thought-provoking. If your goal was to leave us with some strong feelings, not just about climbing and the craft of writing, but about ourselves as actors in this world, you've done so. Really want to thank you for taking time to speak with us today. Thanks so much.
Keep writing. And to echo, one last point. It's a glimpse of plausible climate-affected futures, but in a way that's not demotivating. If anything, it's motivating.
Yeah, agreed.
Thank you so much. And also, I just have to, on behalf of all of us writers, thank you so much for paying attention to the art that's coming out in this moment. It's very hard to be a creator right now. And it sometimes feels like nobody even has the space in their brain to read anymore, which is understandable. But folks like, librarians and independent bookstore owners and folks like you who do this type of work, you help keep the written word alive. You help keep creators creating. And so I just want to thank you for your attention to it and just your generosity of spirit in talking about these texts.
That's lovely. Thank you, Ashley. So that closes up for this time. We'll see you next time at the next Climate Book Reviews, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.